You Don't Bring Me Flowers is pretty high up on most people's list of the schmaltziest love songs of all time. And I can't say it isn't earned. I mean,
Used to be's don't count anymore, they just lay on the floor till we sweep them away.
but as long as this song exists,
Looks like muskrat love.
I'll wear my love for this one proudly. The song's journey to musical infamy has been a mighty precarious one. The original is probably the first gender-fluid pop song ever recorded. But the version that many know and some love almost never happened. It was actually the product of a bit of fan fiction,
Record stores deluge with requests for the not yet available record.
born out of real-life heartbreak. And after being supplanted by vanilla rap,
Things to swim, fly, walk, fly, creep, and crawl.
it went on to become one of pop music's earliest remixes, one that eventually led to a lawsuit and an unlikely Grammy performance that's considered by many to be one of the greatest in the show's history. I'm Dara Star Tucker, and this is The Breakdown. We'd like to think that the great songs will magically reveal themselves and that we'll instantly know them when we hear them, but that's not always the case. You Don't Bring Me Flowers took a pretty circuitous path to becoming one of the most loved and loathed duets in pop music. If the song seems to give soapy vibes, then it's doing its job, because that's exactly what it is. As the story goes, singer-songwriter Neil Diamond met TV producer Norman Lear at a party in the 70s, and he told him that he'd like to be involved with one of his projects. It so happened that Norman Lear was working on an idea for a satirical soap opera about a world in which gender roles would be reversed and women would be the dominant alpha partners and men would take on a more submissive stay-at-home role. Pretty controversial stuff at the height of the women's liberation movement. So at Norman Lear's suggestion, Neil Diamond sought out the songwriting duo of Marilyn and Alan Bergman to help him write the role reversal song on spec for Lear's show, which would eventually be titled All That Glitters. It was really just a 45-second chorus, just long enough for a TV theme song. So they write the song from the point of view of an attention-starved husband who doesn't get flowers from his wife anymore. Well, Norman Lear didn't go for it. He scrapped Neil Diamond's idea in favor of criminally misusing the brilliant jazz pop singer Kenny Rankin in a quirky early rap parody that was used as the show's theme song instead.
One morning the Lord, she woke up to say, I feel like I want to be creative today.
Probably the first sign of trouble for this nightly series, which ended up lasting only one season, mercifully. Anyway, Neil Diamond starts singing this short-form version of the role reversal soap opera theme song that never was at his shows, and his audiences really seem to like it, so he gets back together with the Bergmans, and they flesh it out into a full track. Neil Diamond includes this completed version of You Don't Bring Me Flowers on his 1977 album, I'm Glad You're Here With Me Tonight.
You don't bring me flowers.
It's not released as a single, so it doesn't make much of a splash. Now, by 1978, actress and vocal powerhouse Barbra Streisand is at the height of her prowess. She's newly permed and fresh off of A Star Is Born, and her star could not possibly be shining any brighter. She and Neil Diamond knew each other from way back. They went to Erasmus Hall High School together in Brooklyn in the late 50s. Barbara heard Neil's new song, and she decided that she'd like to include it on her upcoming project called Songbird. It didn't hurt that Marilyn and Alan Bergman were also the writers of Barbara's first #1 hit, The Way We Were, along with Marvin Hamlish. Now, although Neil and Barbara were classmates and both had seen major successes in the music industry, their careers had taken very different trajectories. Neil was an electrifying live performer, but he hadn't had a #1 hit since Cracklin' Rosie in 1970 and Song Sung Blue in 72. Barbara, on the other hand, hadn't performed a major live show since her Central Park concert in 1967. That experience had left her with terrible stage fright and a fear of performing in front of an audience. There was a technical glitch with her prompter that was likely intentional on the part of her stage director that caused her to nearly flub her lyrics at that televised show with 135,000 people in attendance. It was such a disorienting experience that she decided that live performances really weren't worth the trouble. There was way too much that was out of her control. So she focused on her film career and making studio albums for the next 30 years, and it paid off. By 1978, she was already an EGOT. She had won 7 Grammys, 2 Oscars, 2 Emmys, and a Tony. She did do a televised concert in 1975, and this was the reception. I mean, she really was the Beyoncé of her day if Beyoncé never did any shows. But Barbara and Neil's musical worlds would soon collide thanks to a Louisville radio station program director for whom a song about a marriage on the rocks would hit particularly close to home. Gary Guthrie, who worked at WAKY-AM in Louisville, Kentucky, was going through a divorce from his wife Becky right around the time that Neil's version of the song was released in 1977. He noticed at a party that Neil's recording of You Don't Bring Me Flowers made his soon-to-be ex-wife tear up. A few months after that, Barbara's version of the song was released, another favorite of his wife's, and again, the same reaction. Since their divorce was fairly amicable, he decided that he wanted to give his wife a parting gift. Since she had had similar reactions to both versions of the song and she loved both Neil and Barbara, Gary decided that it might be an interesting experiment to mix both versions into a rough duet for her. Gary really didn't spend much time on the air, but he was at the station all the time. He and Becky were divorcing, but they still lived together even though they didn't share a bed anymore. So for him, there really wasn't much of a reason to run home at the end of the day. He was spending lots of time at the office, particularly at night, so he used that time to work on the rough remix of Barbara and Neil's two versions of the song. The fortunate thing for him was that both songs were done in the same key, C major, and they were very close in tempo. He used the radio station's 4-track mixer to splice both versions of the song together. He used Neil's version for the first verse,
You don't bring me flowers.
and Barbara's version for the second verse,
You don't sing me love songs.
and at the end, he fused both versions together.
You don't bring me flowers.
He wanted to get an idea of how the remix would sound on the radio, so he thought the late night shift might be the best time to try it out. So he'd give the rough tape to his overnight DJs and he would have them play it while he went out to his car to listen. The early mixes weren't quite right, so after the song would play on the air, he would fiddle with the splicing again, and then he'd have the late night DJ play it the next night while he sat in his car and listened again so he could hear how the song was shaping up. He kept up this back and forth through several edits until he had it just right, and he finally got up the courage to spin it for the daytime audience. To say that he wasn't prepared for the response would have been a massive understatement. In Gary's own words, all hell broke loose. The station's phone was ringing off the hook with requests for the song. Women were showing up at record stores in Louisville asking for the duet, and the clerks had no idea what they were talking about. No such song existed. The women would become more and more belligerent, demanding that they produce this non-existent recording, and they would eventually storm out in anger. Husbands and boyfriends were calling the radio station complaining that their wives and girlfriends were asking them to locate a song that apparently only existed at this station. Soon after this, DJs at Chicago's WGN and Detroit's WJR got the idea to do the same thing and received a similar response. It started to become obvious that an actual duet of this song might make a splash. It just so happened that both Neil Diamond and Barbra Streisand were signed to Columbia Records, so the whole idea wasn't that far out of reach. And through his time in radio, Gary had gotten to know a couple of guys at Columbia who could help him get the remix of the song to the label's head, Bruce Lundvall. When Bruce Lundvall finally heard it and learned about the buzz that had been created from the remixes, he shut that whole thing down. He sent cease and desist letters to the stations that were playing the copycat versions of the spliced together remix, but he didn't send one to Gary. After that, he reached out to Neil Diamond and asked him if he'd be willing to do a real duet version with Barbara and release it as a single. Neil was all for it and told Bruce to reach out to her. Barbara went for it, and within a few weeks, Neil and Barbara were in the studio tracking an official version of You Don't Bring Me Flowers. So, just to show you how fast this thing moved, Gary's remixed version first aired on May 24th, 1978. He finally got it to CBS by July 27th, and by August 3rd, Streisand and Diamond had agreed to do an official version. The new version was released on October 17th, and by December, it had already reached #1 on Billboard's Hot 100 chart. It eventually went platinum and sold over 1 million copies. Now, Gary felt, rightfully so, that he should receive some sort of compensation for coming up with the idea to do this duet version in the first place, but there were a couple of problems with that from Columbia's standpoint. First of all, Gary wasn't the only person who had the idea to do a remixed version of the song. Clearly, the fact that Columbia head Bruce Lundvall didn't pursue legal action against Gary indicated that they saw his version as the original remix, but the other DJs didn't see it that way, so whatever remuneration they gave Gary, they'd probably really have to provide to multiple people. And secondly, they didn't want to set a precedent within the industry. Someone comes up with an idea and the record company does something similar, and suddenly they're on the hook to give that person a producing credit or royalty payments. And you have to think, this is the late 70s. Hip-hop is barely on the radar at this point. All the battles around sampling and remixing hadn't even begun yet. There was really no precedent for this, which was helpful where early hip-hop was concerned, because they didn't clear any of those samples. Half of that music couldn't even have been made if they had had to pay for those rights. But this was a gray area. Gary wasn't really asking for payment for using their recording in his own successful remix. He felt he was owed 2 cents per single, essentially because of a production idea. So in today's litigious environment, the label probably would have had the good sense to just list him as a producer to avoid a court battle. But this was the wild, wild west in a sense. Columbia had all the power and they knew it. When the label invited Gary up to New York for the release of the single, they asked him then to sign a release and they offered him a small check. He was insulted by the whole thing and he didn't sign anything. He didn't take their money either. So Gary decided to fight for what he felt that he was owed. Reports say that he sued Columbia for somewhere between $5 and $10 million. He ended up settling with them out of court for an undisclosed amount, which he says might have been enough to buy a used VW Bug. He says he regrets settling, but he knew that Columbia, which was owned by CBS, had deep pockets and would have dragged the battle out for years. What Gary did get out of it was a unique parting gift for his ex-wife and about 15 minutes of fame. For a while, every entertainment news outlet in the country wanted to talk to him. Good Morning America, People Magazine. He was even featured on Casey Kasem's America's Top 40.
He took the 2 albums into WAKY's production studio and electronically manufactured a duet by mixing and blending from both recordings onto one tape.
And he was a Jeopardy question. Columbia did send Gary and the other DJs a gold record and a note of thanks for helping to popularize the song. Gary also got a note of thanks from Barbra Streisand and a bouquet of flowers from Neil Diamond. Now, as for Streisand and Diamond, You Don't Bring Me Flowers would end up being the biggest single that year for both of them. It was released too late in the year to be eligible for the '79 Grammys, but it made quite a splash at the 1980 awards. It was nominated for 2 Grammys, Record of the Year and Best Pop Vocal Performance, Duo or Group, but it didn't actually end up winning anything. What did happen that night was probably more significant than a win, though. With the release of a film called Kramer vs. Kramer in 1979, divorce was, for the first time, being discussed openly and honestly. The culture was grappling with the complexities and impact of divorce on the family unit for the first time in popular media. Audiences were particularly attuned to these kinds of stories in that moment, so Grammy producer Ken Ehrlich wanted to see if he could actually get Barbra and Neil to perform the song live at the Grammys. Everyone knew by this point that Barbra was not a live performer. She rarely made public appearances at all. Well, Ken Ehrlich decided to use this to the Grammys' advantage. He didn't announce that they would be performing, partly because he knew that the element of surprise would create a memorable Grammy moment, and partly because there was no guarantee that Barbra would actually show up. Even Barbra wasn't sure that she would be there. She ended up following through with her appearance, though, mostly out of love for the song's co-writers, Marilyn and Alan Bergman. So she comes to the rehearsal earlier in the day, and the stage director has set out 2 stools, and between them there's a vase of flowers. The idea is that they'll sit on these stools with the flowers in between them and sing the song to each other. You know, you don't bring me flowers, and there's the flowers, and they're singing about the flowers. Well, Barbra, who's always been a director at heart, thought that made no sense at all. Why would there be flowers on the stage when the name of the song is You Don't Bring Me Flowers? She told the director that she'd like to start out the performance with her on one side of the stage and Neil on the other side, and to nix the flowers altogether. She wanted a darkened stage with just 2 spotlights introducing them. This would represent the alienation that the couple was feeling. Then they would walk towards each other slowly, and they would come together only at the end just to acknowledge that their relationship was over. Barbra was an actress, so she had this whole backstory in her head about a couple that had been married for 20 years who had slowly grown apart. She talked over the idea with Neil in their dressing room, and he was on board. So no one knew that this performance was happening. They got through the entire show with no mention of it. But to add to the element of surprise, Barbra even asked Ken Ehrlich not to make any announcement before they walked onto the stage. So no one in the actual audience knew that this was about to happen. So right after the final commercial break of the show, with no warning whatsoever, Barbra and Neil just emerge from the sidelines, completely unexpected, and the crowd goes wild. They finally started up the music just to calm them down. Barbara says she was shaking like a leaf.
Now after loving me late at night,
Well, it's good for you, and you're feeling alright.
Neil hit his marks and executed her idea just as they discussed.
and you don't bring me flowers anymore.
And then towards the end of the song, there's this moment where she reaches up and does this.
You don't say you need me.
You don't sing me love songs.
Which is reminiscent of this.
You
And the
don't
audience is in a
bring
frenzy
me
again. And then Neil does this. And it's just the most satisfying moment. They absolutely brought down the house and got a standing O at a time when that was pretty rare. It turned out to be one of the most memorable Grammy performances of all time. So for a song that started out as a rejected theme for a gender-bending TV show that was then fleshed out into a full-fledged meditation on marital alienation, that was eventually recorded separately by two of pop music's biggest stars, that could have nevertheless been relegated to deep-cut obscurity, but was resurrected as one of pop music's first remixes, which led to a bona fide hit that triggered a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and culminated in one of the Grammy Awards' most iconic moments. You Don't Bring Me Flowers didn't do too badly for itself. It surmounted multiple hurdles to its very existence to then become one of the most parodied duets ever.
You don't bring me flowers.
Schmaltz or not, You Don't Bring Me Flowers has stood the test of time and has earned its place as one of the most durable breakup songs in pop music history.
If you're a fan of The Breakdown, become a supporter at patreon.com, where you'll receive exclusive behind-the-scenes content and sneak peeks at what's on the horizon. Visit patreon.com/Dara Star Tucker to sign up.